What is going on, Next.js Conf? I am super excited to be here and talk to you about protecting your Next.js apps. Standard, who am I? My name is James Q. Quick, and I am a developer, speaker, and teacher. And I've been doing a combination of those three things professionally for almost 10 years now, which is kind of hard to believe. And then more importantly, I am a developer media manager at Auth0. So I work a lot with our technical YouTube content and technical content geared towards developers like yourself. Now, all of that comes down to, I kind of sum up my career and what I do as I teach developers through content. And I am really excited to teach you a little bit today about how to protect your applications in Next.js. So a couple of expectations. This is not a security deep dive. We're going to avoid buzzwords. We're going to avoid deep dives into identity concepts. This is specifically targeted at app developers, developers who want to build stuff and get things done, not security professionals. Also, a quick heads up. I am an employee at Auth0, so you'll see lots of references to our Auth0 SDKs in this talk. For the most part, the concepts that we talk about won't be specific to Auth0, so they can still apply regardless of if you use another tool to handle your authentication authorization needs for the applications that you build. So let's start with, what is the Jamstack? We've all been there before. You probably have a decent idea of it yourself, or maybe you don't. The interesting thing about the Jamstack is that there's really not a great definition for what the Jamstack is. If you ask everyone watching this video what their definition is, those definitions will probably vary from person to person. But we can at least start with the acronym. The JAM in Jamstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. Now, none of these things inherently are new concepts. We've had JavaScript for a long time. We've used APIs for a long time. We've used markup for a long time. None of those things inherently are new. So the Jamstack to me really is just a new way to combine old things. We're starting to get much more creative with the way we build web applications. And we start to use some of those existing technologies, not that there aren't new ones, but we use a lot of those existing things and just use them in a different way, which is kind of cool. And with the Jamstack comes a focus on static content. Now here again, we kind of lack a true definition of what static content is. If you were to poll everyone watching this video on what their definition is for static content, you would probably get lots of different answers. So our question becomes, what even is static? What does that mean in this case? Well, if you go to Wikipedia, they give you a definition. Wikipedia is the truth of all source, of course. And they say web page is one that's delivered to the browser as stored, in contrast to dynamic web pages, which we'll talk about more throughout the application, throughout the presentation, that are generated by a web application. So that's fine. A little simpler version here is one that I came up with. It's a set of files that can be hosted as is on a CDN, or a content delivery network. Now, a content delivery network is very beneficial because it can replicate those files all across the world and make it really quick and easy to get access to those files and send them back down to the browser. Now you're probably thinking like, oh, well, I don't know any CDN options that I could use. Well, you are in luck, because Vercel is an awesome CDN that you can use for hosting your static sites, in addition to lots of other things that we'll talk about in this presentation. So the really cool thing about this is that you're not having to maintain a server. You're not having to do updates or patches or things like that. And that really gets into the benefits of the Jamstack. It's very performant. If you think about, there's no real-time calculation for this static content. It's just being sent down. That stuff is really fast to get to. High security. You're not maintaining a server. You're not doing patches. You're not doing updates. So you don't have to worry as much of that type of security, about that type of security. It's scalable, right? It's just files that are sitting there. Those can scale up infinitely when you get the big rush for people that are ordering Christmas presents from your site or whatever. And then probably my favorite piece is the developer experience. There's lots of different things that factor into that. So you might be wondering, talking about static content in the Jamstack, do static sites mean static experiences? And to answer that, I'll go back to our definition. Our definition is it's a set of files that can be hosted as is on a CDN. Well, the interesting thing about that is React actually falls into this category. If you're familiar with React, I imagine you are, you know that React has a build process. You do a build of your React app, and the output of that is a static set of files that can be hosted on the CDN. It in no way means that React applications or websites are static themselves in terms of experience. It just means that the output is a set of files. Now you get to Next.js. Next.js can do everything that React can, and then a lot of things on top of that, which means Next.js can do the exact same thing and produce what I consider to be static content. But we also know that Next.js takes it to the next level. This is something that we'll talk a lot about as we go through this presentation. So I want to get into the 3 different types of content that exist in the Jamstack. Now you may have a couple that you could debate or add in addition to these, but there's kind of 3 core examples of content inside of Jamstack. So first is CSR. This is client-side rendered content. You can have statically generated content coming from a static site generator, SSG. You can also have server-side rendered content. Abbreviation here is SSR, and then here's those definitions for you. So you also have like incremental static regeneration, and there's some other keywords and that kind of stuff in there. But this is kind of core to me, I think, in terms of the types of content that you have at your disposal in the Jamstack. So let's start with client-side rendered. So again, we go back to this concept of React. Now, Next.js can do everything that React can. It can act just like React if you use it that way. So we can just start with, like, if we're using client-side rendered applications, we can kind of think about the SPA idea, single page application, and we can focus on just React for now. And so these are just pages that are hosted in a CDN somewhere that are sent down to the browser, and then things happen. JavaScript runs and things happen. So the first question is, how do you do authentication and authorization with a single page application? Well, let's start with some fancy buzzwords. Let's just kind of see where we get there. Let's say OAuth 2.0. Let's say OpenID Connect. Let's say authorization code flow with proof key for code exchange, otherwise known as PXE. You're probably confused by those. You probably don't know the intimate details about those different things. And the important part here is you don't have to. Is it useful for you to have knowledge of what those things are and what those workflows are and how they work? Yeah, that'd be great. But this talk is targeted at people that want to build stuff. So the cool answer is, like, you don't quite have to know. One key thing to understand here, though, is that authentication in single page applications can be very different based on the fact that a single page app can't keep a secret. We'll talk much more about this as we go through the talk. In fact, it'll be kind of a theme in this talk. But this changes the requirements of how we do auth in the most secure way. That's where the PXE comes from, the proof key for code exchange. So you can go out and do some more research on that if you're interested. But that's one important factor about a single page app is it cannot keep a secret because that code is in the browser, it's public. API keys, secrets can be read by somebody if they want to. So here's a diagram that shows that flow, the authorization code flow with PXE. And the key thing here is that the output of this is an ID token and an access token. We'll talk a little bit more about those. In fact, we can now do a little bit of a comparison between the two at a very high level. ID tokens are mainly used for authentication. They contain general info about the user themselves. Access tokens are more for authorization, and typically what you'll do is send those to a backend API for validating authorization for getting to an actual resource, doing some sort of CRUD operation on a piece of data, that sort of thing. So we'll come back to that. More to come. But don't worry, it's not that bad. The cool thing is, this is what SDKs are for. There are tons of things that there are a lot of technical details behind the scenes that we as developers never know because we don't need to because of SDKs and tools that are out there to help us solve those problems. Now, again, if you're interested in OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, PXE, authorization code flow, go and do some extra research. It's actually really kind of interesting and neat, but you don't have to know that, especially for the context of this talk. So now I'll get into an example of our specific Auth0 React SDK. So implementing authentication, authorization inside of a React application using Auth0. There's the GitHub link if you want to check it out. But it's pretty cool. You can create an Auth0 provider with history. So this taps into whatever history, routing package you're using for React, like React Router. It taps into that. You can create that Auth0 provider with history, and then you wrap your application, and that's kind of most of the setup. After you have that set up, then you can go into your React code, and then you can just call a function. So we have this use Auth0 hook. If you use that hook, you can get from it the login with redirect function, and then you just have a button that says call this function. It redirects the user over to Auth0. They do their authentication. They come back to your application. And then how do you know if they're actually authenticated? Well, you can get another property from this use_auth0 hook, which is authenticated. And then based on is authenticated, you can show a logout button, a login button. You could show and hide different pages if you want to. You can also grab profile information for the user. So from the use_auth0 hook, you also get a user object. From the user object, you can get name, picture, email, things like that, and you can display profile information. So this is a pretty common thing, right? You need some sort of SDK or something you build to keep track of the user. And then you want to know, is the user logged in? If they are, what's the information about the user? How do I get access to that? What functions do I have to call for login, logout, etc.? In this case, this Auth0 SDK provides you a pretty cool hook here, the use Auth0 hook, that gives you access to all those things. And you just build your app accordingly. It's pretty neat. So my question then becomes, how do we get dynamic data? So we talked about this is a single page application. We talked a little bit about how you can do authentication, but where does data actually come from? Well, you fetch data from an API using JavaScript. You see what we did there based on the Jamstack JavaScript APIs. So that's how we want to get data, but where do we actually get that data? Well, you can use a traditional database. You can use a headless CMS. You can use a general API of some sort. And their goal, those services, is to make it as easy as possible for you to implement those services and store your data in their service. So you start looking at SDKs for these things. Here's Trello and Cloudinary and Sanity. And there's a bunch of different ones. And as you go through this documentation, you start looking at API keys and secret keys and app IDs and auth tokens. And you're like, I don't really know what to do with that. One caveat I should say here, the app ID is not necessarily secret. Those other three are. But primarily, there's some sort of secret credential that you have to use to interact with that data source, that API, that headless CMS. And unfortunately, the browser is not safe. Your source code is not safe. So you can't check API keys, secret keys, auth tokens into your source code that goes on GitHub. People can go and grab the token out of it. You also can't ship that token and code to the browser because there are developer ninjas out there just waiting for you to mess up and check that stuff in and go and grab your API keys and do whatever they want with them. Trust me, I've learned this the hard way. I have checked in a decent amount of API keys in my past, and it has been a huge hassle. So the takeaway here is to never reveal your secrets. And hint, this is actually going to be a pretty big theme of what we talk about for the rest of this talk. So something to keep in mind there. So naturally, your question is, okay, if I want data from these places, where do I actually get that data? What do I do? How do I get access to it? Well, I'm going to do a cop out here. I'm going to say, we'll revisit that in a few minutes. We'll come back to that. In the meantime, let's move on to our second style of content, is statically generated content that comes from static site generators. And lo and behold, this is Next.js Conf. Who knew Next.js can provide, basically act as a static site generator and give you static content. Now, I do want to clarify what a static site generator does in terms of acting or interacting with a data source and when. So let's compare really quickly. A static site generator, or a tool like Next.js that can do static site generation, can generate static pages. Now let's compare that with, lack of a better word, a dynamic site. Your WordPress, your Ruby on Rails, your Node backend with EJS templating, server-side rendered applications like that. So let's start with static site generation. You interact with a data source at build time. This means when you go and build your site, it's going to go out to the data source and say, hey, give me all the data like blog posts. That's the common example. Grab that information, generate pages based on it, and create those static pages. Now, because of that, this means that anytime you add new content to your data source, you're going to have to do a new build to see that new content on your website. Now, the benefits of this is kind of the Jamstacky stuff. It will be super fast. It will be secure because you're not running a server. You'll have great development experience because you can just kind of check in code, run a build command, and your site is live. And it's really easy to use. It's really pretty cool. A dynamic site, on the other hand, is real time. That means that it's going to interact with a data source as you make a request for a given web page. So you make a request to this page. The server says, I need some data for that. I go to the data source, grab the data, generate the markup, then send that down in real time to the user. Now, this means if there's extra data that's added to the database, you don't have to go through a build. It's going to now be reflected on the website. So that's one of the benefits here is there's no extra builds necessary. And this has been an established strategy for years. This is kind of the traditional way that we do web applications, or was at least for a long time. So static site generators in general, are going to get data at build time and generate markup. You see what we did there too? JavaScript, APIs, markup. Going back to the Jamstack. And the good thing about this, the interesting thing about this, the most important thing about this means that secret keys are okay. So since you're running this build process on a server, you can add environment variables into your host platform like Vercel, leverage those during the build process, generate that static content, never have to worry about getting those keys leaked by shipping them to the browser. It won't be in the browser, it's just running on the server, and then you've got static content. So that's cool. But let's go back to this question of how do we do authentication and authorization? Well, this answer with statically generated content actually becomes really easy, specifically with Next.js through a process called rehydration. And what rehydration is when you ship a piece of static content with Next.js, it's also going to ship React. And then on the front end, React can run just like it would in a regular single page application, just like it would in regular React. So this is really important for authentication and authorization because now you can do anything that you could before. You can treat everything almost the exact same, actually the exact same way as you did before because you're just running React on the front end just like you did before anyway. So that's kind of neat. And the question then becomes, okay, we still got the same question. How do we get dynamic data for this? What if we need to add, we have statically generated pages for blog posts, but now we want to dynamically pull in the comments? Well, we go back to this answer of, we're going to fetch data from an API using JavaScript, Jamstack. But don't forget, those developer ninjas are still out there waiting for you to check in environment variables or API keys to your source code. So we can't do that. We still have this gap of how do we interact with some sort of data source in a reasonable way. And this is where serverless functions come into play. Serverless functions now can run with minimal effort, really cool, and keep a secret. This is a constant theme in this talk is who can keep a secret. So you can run code in a serverless function, which, fun fact, runs on a server, which means you have access to environment variables and you can do all the things that you need to interact with your data source, whatever it is. Now, serverless functions are pretty awesome when done well because you just write a function and then magic happens. And you might be asking, like, where would I host these magical functions? Well, this is probably no spoiler alert here, but Vercel not only, or in addition to hosting your static content that we talked about earlier, can also serve your serverless functions or host your serverless functions. So the interesting thing about then like kind of moving logic to serverless functions for that API key is what stops people from just calling that serverless function directly. If that serverless function is out there, it's kind of just acting as a proxy. How do I actually protect that API route, that serverless function, depending on how you think of it? This is where access tokens come in. So we talked about, or we showed really quickly with the Auth0 SDK following OpenID Connect and OAuth 2, the output of that is the user will get, or the code will get, an ID token and an access token. Access tokens be primarily used for authorization. So what we can do inside of this React world is from that use Auth0 hook, we get a function called get access token silently. We can grab the access token from a logged in user and then just send that in the request to a backend API. So it could be a serverless function. Well, actually, it would be a serverless function. It could be a different API on a different platform, but this could just as easily be an API route or serverless function hosted on Vercel. And inside of that request, we just attach that bearer token, or excuse me, that access token as a bearer token property for the authorization header. Now, I won't show you the backend code for this because that can be solved in multiple different ways, but on the backend, it's their responsibility to validate and then authorize access to certain things based on that access token that is being sent along. So this is how we can get away from not checking in secret keys to our front end, using serverless functions to kind of be that proxy, but also then protecting our serverless functions to make sure that only the appropriate person is able to call them and act upon them when they do. So this leads us to SSR, server-side rendering. And the really funny thing about this is Jamstack has come full circle. Jamstack had this really big focus on static content. That's kind of where this evolved. And then it kind of came to the conclusion of like, hey, like static content is great, but what if we need some server-side rendered content? What if we need some dynamic content? Well, that's where server-side rendering comes in play here. And no surprise, Next.js now can do that too, because Next.js can do it all. And frameworks like Next.js that can do it all, I'm kind of titling, I don't know if this is a thing or if I just made it up, titling hybrid Jamstack. These hybrid Jamstack frameworks can do it all. They can do CSR, they can do SSG, they can do SSR, and here's the acronyms spelled out again. So now the question becomes, how do we do authentication and authorization? Well, there's some things that change specifically in Next.js, because since you're running your serverless functions and your front end, and they're kind of on the same domain, you can now start to track things in cookies. And so now you'd have to learn about, like, how do I do these cookies? How do I still implement OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect on the back end to go and get the access token and ID token? And where do I store that information? And what type of cookie? Is it secure? Is it HTTP only? All those details. That sort of stuff comes into play now. And now you have this mix of, I need authentication for server-side render content. I need authentication for static content, and all the different things that Next.js can do. Well, again, the Auth0 Next.js SDK is I am biased, but is very, very sweet. I think in the most unbiased opinion I can have, this SDK is really fantastic. Now, there are other SDKs that have similar functionality, so don't think this is your only option, but this one is, in my mind, top notch. It's actually really, really good. So let's take a look at how you would set that up. Well, you think like, all right, you install the package and you do a bunch of things. Well, this is kind of it. You create a file in a certain location. It's a dynamic route handler. And what this does is, just by doing this and having your environment variable set inside of your .env file, is this will generate API routes for /login, /logout, /callback, and technically it's API auth, login, logout, callback, and then me for profile information. Which means those routes now are hosted or basically work as serverless functions, which now means I can just create a login button that's a link to /API/auth/login. Logout would be the same type thing, /logout. But this gets really cool next, because also there's still a use user hook on the front end that gives you access to the user is authenticated and things like that. So this use user hook now, not only can I handle like server-side authentication and tracking of that authenticated user, I also have hooks to work with that user on the front end and display some sort of information of, are they a login or are they an admin? If they are, show the admin button, show the admin link to get to the admin page. And then we get into even more functionality, which is, what if you want to protect your pages? What if you want to say, hey, if you're requesting to get access to this page, you need to be logged in. I don't want you to get access to this page if you're not logged in. Well, on the front end, we would have to do some checks, right? To say, hey, before we render this page, if we were in a single page app, check the status of the logged in user and do whatever checks we need. Now with get server side props and with this hook from Auth0 with page auth required, now we can just wrap our get server side props with this hook, and it will automatically make sure the user is logged in and not let them get to your page unless they are logged in. Pretty neat. And then you can do extra authorization stuff by checking properties of the user and that sort of stuff. But just with using with page auth required, it will protect those pages. Probably not a shocker here. There's also a with API auth required, which does the same thing for your API routes. So now you have the ability to make sure a user is logged in before they can access an API route. Then you can also do authorization based on some sort of claims or properties about that user. Are they an admin? Do they have other access, et cetera, et cetera. So that I think is really cool. And I want to end with a couple of integrations that I've done just with working with different data sources that I thought would be fun. One is Airtable. I use Airtable for a lot of automations and things that I do. I think Airtable is really great. It's very flexible. I use it for automated newsletter and sharing things out of my Discord with a Discord bot and lots of really cool stuff. So to integrate with Airtable, you need one of those API keys. We've talked about this kind of over and over again. And so the question becomes like, all right, where do you use your API key safely? Well, we've talked about serverless functions and how you can use your serverless function as a proxy. Like instead of calling Airtable directly, call the serverless function, which calls Airtable with the API key, but it uses that securely in an API route, which only runs on the server with Next.js. So you're using your serverless function as a proxy. And this is a very common pattern because you can do this for any API that you want to. Anything that you can't access directly from the front end, you can call a serverless function API route in Next.js, have that thing then call the API with that secret key, and you're kind of good to go. So that's really cool. And then there are some platforms, FaunaDB, or Fauna is one of them that I have worked with, that has an even more direct integration. And there's a YouTube video on my YouTube channel if you want to check this out. Serverless authentication and authorization in minutes with Fauna and Auth0. And what this allows you to do is take that access token that comes from Auth0 and send that directly to Fauna. And you can configure Fauna to know how to validate that access token to make sure it came from the right place and then leverage that, associate that with a role with rules inside of Fauna that define rules for CRUD operations on your data, which means I could actually do this directly from the front end, not really need a back end, and then interact with Fauna directly by sending that access token along. That is really, really cool. This is kind of almost what dreams are made of, honestly, to be able to do that stuff directly. So a little bit of configuration inside of Fauna. I can send my access tokens directly to Fauna. Fauna then knows how to interpret and validate those access tokens and then compare that with rules that are associated with a role inside of Fauna. Full video if you want to check that out. Now, the last one, Supabase, is a technology I've been pretty excited about. I think it's really, really neat. It's an open source alternative to Firebase. So this same concept, I think, will apply to Firebase as well. But when working with Supabase, what we found was Supabase does authentication itself. So Supabase can do authentication. What we found was the way it validates that authentication on the back end is through an access token as well. So we can kind of trick and take our access token from Auth0, grab the user ID from that access token, the sub property is actually what it's called, and then generate a new token with the signing secret that is inside of Supabase. Now, what this means is we now have a token that Supabase knows how to understand, and we can attach that to the Supabase client. This is something that's configured on the front end again. And then we can send that to Supabase, and inside of Supabase, you can define with policies your authorization, who's allowed to access what based on that token that's coming in. That's really cool as well, because this means that you can do this, again, all from the front end, not even need a back end if you don't want or need it. Pretty cool. John Meyer is a developer advocate at Supabase as well. So you can go and check out, he's got role level security RLS with Supabase video on YouTube that I thought was really interesting in terms of defining those authorization rules inside of really what just comes down to SQL. There's a link to that one as well. So those are a couple of the different integrations that I think are really neat with other platforms that I thought you might be interested in as well. That is going to wrap up this talk. If you're interested in any more information or the slides, you can check it out at jamesqquick.com/talks. If you have any other questions for me, you can reach out to me in the Discord server. I will be hanging around in there to answer any questions that you have. So make sure to reach out. You can also reach out later on Twitter at jamesqquick or other places at jamesqquick.com. Thank you all for checking out the talk. I really appreciate it. I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions later on. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.